Good evening and namaste, everyone. Welcome to the last session of Decoding the Idea of Communist China Conference. I am Sneha Kathy Sebastian, a research associate with the forum. In this session, we will decode the Chinese aggression and occupation. The session chair is Major General Asthana, SM, VSF. He is a globally acknowledged strategic and security analyst who has authored over 400 publications. Sir is a veteran infantry general with over 40 years of experience at national and international fields. Furthermore, he has also held key appointments in the Army and United Nations as an instructor, speaker at various CUNPK and UN organizations. He has been awarded twice by the President of India and the United Nations. He is also a receiver of the CEE Excellence Award for Nation Building by the Government of Haryana. Welcome, sir. The speakers for this session are Tsering Passang, founder and chairman of Global Alliance for Tibet and Persecuted Minorities, Ms. Zubayra Shamseden, Chinese outreach coordinator at the Uyghur Human Rights Project, Catherine Lee, an independent artist and activist, and finally, Russell Hsiao, executive director of GTI, senior fellow at the Jamestown Foundation, and adjunct fellow at Pacific Forum. I welcome all the speakers and request Major General Asthana, sir, to proceed with the session. Over to you, sir. Sir, you're on mute.
Thank you, Sneha, and thank you, Indic Research Forum and Chennai Center for Chinese Studies. It's a great pleasure in chairing a session which is so important, because when we talk of China and we talk of expansionism and the aggressiveness of China, there are certain areas which are greatly impacted by that. And today we have specialists from those areas to highlight what they have actually seen and experienced due to the expansionism and the aggressiveness of China. We all are aware that last century, China calls it as the century of humiliation, wherein a number of powers invaded China, mostly from the eastern seaboard, as well as from the Mongol side. And the initial China, actually, if you think of it, psychologically, as well as on ground, they used to think that, okay, China is limited by the Chinese, shall we say, Great Wall of China. In fact, that was the actual China or the real China at that point of time. So Chinese Great Wall was built basically to protect China. And therefore, the periphery, which this Great Wall defines, was actual China. The rest, everything is Chinese occupied territory. They did occupy Inner Mongolia in 1947, Tibet, Manchuria, and Xinjiang in 1949. And this expansionism trend continues. Earlier, China used to say that, okay, it's a peaceful rise of China. But now this peaceful rise has actually given birth to an assertive China, which has become an aggressive China. And if not controlled, it will also become a chaotic China. And therefore, it is necessary for the world to get together and understand the design and perhaps initiate the mitigating activities to ensure that the expansionism does not go beyond a point that it creates a global chaos. Now, in its expansionism, let me just highlight one more thing before I hand over the forum to the specialists. Is the Chinese strategy of so-called active defense, which in my writings I have written that it is now become incremental encroachment strategy, which is exhibited whether it is in Ladakh or it is in South China Sea. Now, with this incremental encroachment strategy, China wants to win without fighting, as Sun Tzu tells them. And basically, they want to grab some area and test the reactions of the rest of the world. If there is no reaction, then that area goes to them. And if there is a reaction, then you hold on and then wait for another opportunity. And Corona gave a fair amount of opportunity to China to make gains into a number of areas. So this is how perhaps the expansionism is going. Now there are 4 areas and 4 speakers which I can proudly say are the specialists of that particular area. And therefore, let me first turn on to the first speaker, Mr. Tsering Passang, as it was mentioned, founder, chairman of Global Alliance for Tibet and Persecuted Minorities. You've been director of Tibet Foundation, chairman, Tibet Community in Britain, special advisor of Tibet Society, Tibet Relief Fund, and program manager also earlier. And you studied in University of England. We couldn't have a better speaker to speak on Tibet. And Tibet is quite close to our heart, as well as of interest to, I think, most of the Indians, because after annexation of Tibet, we all know that the border remained unsettled, and between whatever treaties were signed between British India and Tibet, China refuses to accept them. So therefore, there is a fair amount of element of anxiety between what happens in Tibet and how does China treat Tibet, and how do we position ourselves as far as Tibet is concerned. So over to you, Mr. Tsering.
Okay, thank you, Major. Thank you very much for having me. Greetings to everyone. First of all, I would like to express my sincere appreciation and thank you to the Indic Researchers Forum and the Chennai Center for China Studies for the invitation and allowing me to share a Tibetan perspective on China's annexation of Tibet. Can you hear me okay? Oh, thank you. As introduced, I am a Tibetan and I was born in a refugee camp in Nepal. And my father, he joined the Tibetan resistance movement in Mustang, which was backed by CIA in the 60s. And he was young actually when he joined, and he was literally crossing the border from Tibet into Nepal. And then a year later, after he met my mother, and I was born in a refugee camp, and then moved from refugee camp to another. And I studied in India and Nepal before coming to the UK like 26 years ago. And Tibet, although I've never been to Tibet, I was hoping to go to Tibet, but never been to Tibet. But I've interacted with many people, Tibetans, as well as Tibetan officials or delegations, scholars from Tibet when they were in England, Tibetan musicians, so many Tibetans I have interacted, and the organizations that I work for also had some projects in Tibet. So through that, I have sort of understanding of what's going on, besides doing the readings and so on. I would begin by saying that prior to China's invasion of Tibet, in terms of spiritual technology development on the Tibetan plateau, Tibetans were very much in advanced stage. The great Mahasiddhas and scholars from India massively helped the Tibetans with the import of Buddhism into Tibet from India. On the part of the Tibetans, we focus on the development of internal well-being and spirituality rather than physical or material consumptions. Therefore, no attention was given to any physical infrastructure development. And we know that Tibet is a very landlocked country. History tells us that the Tibetan spiritual leaders over many centuries, including the Sakyapas and the Dalai Lamas, have played vital roles as spiritual guides to political leaders in the neighboring countries, including to the Mongol emperors, thereby pacifying the rulers that helped towards peaceful conflict resolutions rather than engaging in wars. In short, past spiritual rulers of Tibet enjoyed priest-patron relationship with its neighboring rulers, some kind of soft power in today's time, if I may use it. In history, Tibet had experienced invasion from its powerful countries and its neighbors. And there were also times when Tibetan rulers invaded its neighbors. As I'm here to speak on the China's annexation of Tibet, I will briefly touch on the previous 13th Dalai Lama. Of the 14 Dalai Lamas of Tibet to date, the 14th Dalai Lama currently resides in India. What we know about his previous 13th 13th Dalai Lama is that he had to flee Tibet in 1910 to India after Manchu's Qing dynasty came to establish direct rule on Tibet. But after the collapse of Qing dynasty in 1912, the 13th Dalai Lama returned from India and later expelled the remaining Chinese from Tibet and proclaimed Tibet independence on 13th of February 1913. Until the Communist China invasion, Tibet enjoyed de facto independence. Tibet signed treaties with Great Britain. The famous Simla Treaty of 1914 is an example which defined today's McMahon Line, the demarcation of Tibet and India. The so-called peaceful liberation of Tibet by Mao Zedong from the foreign imperialists is mere excuse for the Communist China to enter Tibet and invade this peaceful country and absorb the whole Tibetan plateau into mainland China for its political, economic, and strategic purposes. Unfortunately, the fate of the Tibetan nation and the Tibetan people changed forever after Mao Zedong formally declared his intention to liberate Tibet on Radio Peking on 1st October 1949. Soon, the PLA troops marched into Tibet from the eastern frontiers. Tibetans did what they could at the time, despite the limited resources at their disposal, resisting the much advanced and experienced PLA troops who had abundance of well-equipped modern military weapons. After Chamdo town in the east was conquered in 1950 and the small Tibetan army was defeated, China's annexation of Tibet advanced to central Tibet. Peaceful negotiations pursued to avoid further military clashes, destruction, and deaths. The Tibetan delegation led by Ngakpe Ngawang Jingme, one of the Tibetan ministers before Tibet was invaded, had to sign the 17-point agreement, which was masterminded by the Chinese government in Beijing. The Tibetan delegation faced the option of further military operations from the Chinese should they refuse to sign the 17-point agreement, which was finally signed on 23rd of May 1951. So today, Tibet is under still illegal occupation of China. Over 1.2 million Tibetans have died since the invasion. Despite, after 9 years of concerted efforts to work with the Chinese government to avoid bloodshed on the Tibetan plateau, the young Dalai Lama, with no option, had to leave his country into exile in India, where he sought political asylum in March 1959. The Indian government under the Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru granted humanitarian and many other support to help the Tibetan refugees to rebuild their lives and education in India. The Tibetan government was soon reestablished with the aim of garnering political support internationally for the independence of Tibet from China. Though India did not officially recognize Dharamsala-based Central Tibet administration as the Tibetan government in exile, nonetheless, New Delhi allowed Tibetan refugees to engage in political protests against Beijing to some extent. The current situation in Tibet is getting worse. Over 160 Tibetans, young, old, monks, nuns, men, and women have engaged in self-immolations without hurting anyone else or damaging properties since 2009. Their message of engaging in such drastic action is simple: calling for freedom, justice, democracy, and the return of the Dalai Lama back to Tibet, where he truly belongs. Tibetans are not allowed to freely visit Tibetan areas or other parts of Tibet. For example, a Tibetan living in East Tibet cannot visit Lhasa, Central Tibet easily without special permits. Likewise, Tibetans in Central Tibet cannot visit eastern parts of Tibet easily. Even Tibetans in western region of Tibet cannot visit Lhasa, Tibet's capital. So literally, every movement of Tibetans in Tibet are restricted, if not completely banned. However, any Han Chinese can travel freely across Tibet. There is no need for a special permit. If the Tibetans cannot travel freely in their own country, what does this mean? This question comes to the minds of Tibetans. And no matter what the Chinese government says about preserving Tibetan culture, what we know is that they don't respect Tibetans' beliefs. There is no room for Tibetans to make their devotion to their spiritual leader, His Holiness Dalai Lama, publicly. If the Chinese authorities found any Tibetans with the Dalai Lama's photo, one is bound to be arrested and put in prison. If one resists their order, it could lead to a very serious situation. Recently, the Tibet Action Institute in the US released a report stating Tibetan children were forcefully put in China's colonial boarding schools to brainwash. We're talking about nearly 1 million Tibetan children. This is a long-term strategy to wipe out Tibetan culture and identity by the Chinese government. The demolition of Buddha statues, destroying Buddhist monasteries, and kicking monks and nuns out from their monasteries and nunneries is another example of the Chinese government's policy to wipe out the Tibetan cultural heritage. Before I conclude, I would like to touch on a few other points. Great Britain had signed treaties with the independent Tibet in the early 1900s, including that 1914 similar agreement, which defined, as I said earlier, today's McMahon line, the demarcation of border between India and Tibet, now so-called Sino-Indo borders. It should be called Indo-Tibet borders. Since Tibet was absorbed into mainland China, several wars broke out with the ongoing clashes between the Indian and the Chinese troops on these tense borders. Tens of thousands of Indian and Chinese troops are stationed on both sides of the Himalayan borders of Tibet and India, which could spark war at any time through a simple misunderstanding. Before China's occupation of Tibet in the 1950s, there were no single Chinese troops stationed along the Himalayan borders, which meant no war between these two Asian giants. I would say securing freedom for the Tibetan people, it's also to secure India's national security interests. Therefore, India should up its effort to find resolution to China-Tibet conflict through various channels, Eva May Humphrey propose, bring Tibet back on the international forum, encourage and facilitate Tibet or Tibetan political representatives to attend major international summits, example, UN bodies, including Human Rights Council, G20, BIMSTEC, COP28, and others. And I think India should also reestablish diplomatic mission in Tibet, like it used to before Communist China came to Tibet. I don't know how many more minutes do I have, or should I just leave it here for now?
Continue.
Okay, all right. And yeah, we do have challenges. As we know, China's economic rise and its foreign influence in foreign reserves, China's massive influence in Africa and other countries around the world also discourages raising Tibet issue at various international platforms. The 54 countries in Africa, virtually support everything or anything China proposed in the UN forums. So these are some of the challenges we face. Now, there are opportunities. As we know, since the COVID-19, the world has woken up, and there are growing appetites around the world to speak up and to stand up. And as we heard throughout these two past days, the Quad Alliance, Indo-Pacific, the China's engagement in the South China Sea, these are opportunities for countries like Tibet or Xinjiang or Hong Kong, and I see this as opportunities for us. And only last year, when G7 summit released statement on Tibet and East Turkestan, I think this was unprecedented, and this is a very welcome. And I think for India's own interest, I think India could, these days, recently we saw the rush of foreign diplomats to New Delhi, meeting prime minister, foreign minister, and so on for various engagements, strategic engagements. I think New Delhi can use this opportunity and up the game on security interests. And I think Tibet and East Turkestan, these could be key points for New Delhi to raise with various countries and speak up on multilateral forum. And this is what we see opportunities in the months and years ahead. I will conclude by highlighting the situation in Ukraine. The illegal aggression by Putin's Russia on Ukraine is reminiscent of what China's illegal invasion of Tibet to the Tibetans. I thank you once again for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tsering. I do, shall I say, appreciate your concern. And I also, I must also say that certainly a lot needs to be done. A lot is being done in a manner that you would have seen the response of India to Chinese aggression. You would have also seen the response of India on diplomatic front when it came to recognizing and giving a full freedom of action to the government in exile. Not only that, I think the government has also at times, in the recent time, I think started off paying paying attention to the to all the releases which are being made by the Tibetan government in exile, as well as our ministers are attending some of the shall we say occasions and some of the meetings which have been made in the recent times. So I think there is a lot happening. Even in the Western side, I believe there was a Tibet Policy Act in 2002 by US. Then there was another one in 2018. And then there was another, I think, US Senator Scott Perry. She also has taken up a case to say that there was a 29th bill, I believe, to recognize Tibet as a country. This was done in USA. So there is a lot which is being done. Let's hope how the messages or the strategic messaging can be given to China in a manner that it does show a better response towards the sensitivities of Tibet. I know that sinicization efforts in Tibet and elsewhere are also on. So therefore, perhaps a lot needs to be done, and I'm sure you have flagged all those issues. So let me now move on to the other area. China has been following a strategy of so-called three evils. And before that, there was another strategy to say that Tibet is a palm and there are five fingers, and so was regarding Xinjiang. Xinjiang is a palm and there are five fingers. Now, Chinese encroachment did not stop at Tibet. It also went on to Xinjiang. The treatment to the Uyghurs is a cause of concern globally. I believe a number of acts have been passed. There is a Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act which is being passed. It's unfortunate to see that we found that in Ukraine, without any probe, Russia was put out or was sent out of UNHRC, but a whole lot of human rights abuses have happened in Xinjiang, and no action has been taken on China by the global community. So I will stop here to speak on that. Let me give the floor to the specialist. Miss Zubayra Shamseden is the Chinese Outreach Coordinator of Uyghur Human Rights Project, UHRP, based in Washington, campaigning for human rights of these people and also the political freedom of the Uyghur people. She has been the Vice President of World Uyghur Conference for 21 to 24 and also chaired the Human Rights Committee, been Information Officer, International Human Rights Democracy Foundation, and you have been also representing these organizations in Australia and United States for almost 2 decades. So I request you to put us wise on what are your views on these issues and what more can be done, what is being done and what more can be done. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you for the nice introduction, Major. Yeah, I would like to speak about decoding communist China from the perspective of Uyghurs. So good morning from America, but good evening to India. Thank you for inviting me to speak at this event, and thank you, Yashas Arya, particularly for providing useful information about the purpose of this event. Let me introduce you the 2 organizations that I work for, which Major just briefly introduced previously. The first, the Uyghur Human Rights Project, where I have my full-time position as Chinese Outreach Coordinator. The Uyghur Human Rights Project was founded by the Uyghurs in the United States in 2003. We needed to fill a huge gap. All the mainstream human rights organizations published almost nothing on the terrible human rights abuse in our homeland of East Turkestan. Since then, we have released more than 90 reports and briefings based on international human rights standards found in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all the major UN human rights treaties and covenants. The second organization that I work for is the World Uyghur Congress, not conference. I serve as vice president on a voluntary basis. The World Uyghur Congress strives to promote democracy, human rights, and freedom for the Uyghur people through peaceful, non-violent, and democratic means. The World Uyghur Congress engages in a wide range of awareness raising and advocacy campaign about the human rights situation for Uyghurs in China, concentrating on the United States Congress, EU member states, as well as EU and UN human rights mechanisms. Now, what's the relationship between the Communist China and the Uyghurs? Uyghurs are linguistically Turkic-speaking people, ethnically belong to Central Eurasia. According to China's official statistics, around 13 million Uyghurs live in East Turkestan, or the current so-called Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which was renamed by the Chinese government in 1955. The literal meaning of Xinjiang is in Chinese, is new territory or new dominant. The region was occupied by the People's Liberation Army in 1949. Since the Chinese Communist occupation of the Uyghur region, the Chinese administration has governed the native Uyghurs with deception and suppression. The Chinese authorities have long violated Uyghurs' cultural, linguistic, and religious rights, marginalizing them in their own homeland. The crackdown on the Uyghur people didn't ease despite the Uyghur people's non-stop dissatisfaction towards the governing policies. In fact, it has gotten worse since the Xi Jinping, the current Chinese president, took power. Especially since 2016, China has turned the Uyghur region into a high-tech surveillance and military state. Now, let me move on to the genocide that happened to Uyghurs. The Uyghur people are experiencing a 21st century high-tech genocide. Over the past 5 years, the Chinese government has set up 24/7 surveillance system to control Uyghurs through facial recognition cameras on every street and the mandatory tracking apps on phones. This capability should be a concern to everyone, not only people living under the Chinese government's authoritarian rule, as China is exporting this technology to the world. In 2017, the government began rounding up ordinary people and throwing them into concentration camps. Our best estimate is that 1.8 to 3 million people have been taken. In these camps, the women's hair was cut off, they were given unknown drug injections and pills. They were subject to many hours per day of forced indoctrination, forced to shout over and over, saying, "There is no God, I don't believe in God, I believe in the Communist Party, my mind was infected by an ideological disease." People are tortured with electric shocks, beatings, and sexual assault. Forced labor, it's another major issue. There is also a massive program of state-imposed forced labor. It doesn't matter if you are a teacher or a farmer or a student or a business owner, you are forced to work in food processing, gums factories, and production of components for solar panels. According to reports, during the pandemic period, India traded with China over $100 billion worth of products. Major traded products were pharmaceutical goods and electronics. There are concerns that these types of products may be tainted with the Uyghur forced labor. As researchers, you may wish to question those Indian business companies whether they are aware of Uyghur forced labor. By buying Chinese-made products, are Indian business entities contributing to China's genocide against Uyghurs? Now let me move on to religious repression. 16,000 mosques have been destroyed and thousands of cemeteries bulldozed. People are sentenced to 7 or 8 years in prison just for praying. According to our organization, the Uyghur Human Rights Project's research, since 2014, 1,046 imams and other religious figures have been detained in the camps or imprisoned for their association with religious teaching and community leadership. The data reveals that of the 1,046 recorded cases, 428 have been sent to formal prisons, including 304 sentenced to prison terms. Of the cases with sentencing information, 96% have received prison terms of 5 years or more, and the 25% was sentenced to 20 years or more, often on unclear charges. Another 202 religious figures have been detained in the camps. 18 have died while in detention or in prison. Another horrific atrocity is forced sterilization and forced birth control. Forced sterilization, forced abortion, and forced birth control measures have meant that the Uyghur birth rate dropped by 50% between 2017 and 2019. The UHRP will soon release a report about the government program to pressure Uyghurs into interracial marriages. In essence, this is a cruel policy of ethnic eradication. And another area is transnational repression. The Chinese government's pursuit of Uyghurs does not stop at China's borders. It is conducting a comprehensive program of transnational repression that includes threats, smears, taking family members as a hostage, black renditions, and forcing Uyghurs to become informers in other countries. The government has created a secret interrogation center in Dubai where Uyghurs are taken. We documented 372 known cases of refoulement, illegal deportation of the Uyghurs to China, where they face certain detention, torture, or worse. Also, the Chinese government refused to renew the passports of Uyghurs who are studying or working in other countries, such as UAE, Turkey, Malaysia, Japan, or anywhere else. This puts them in a completely desperate situation. They cannot extend their work visa or student visa. They cannot travel or on an expired passports. China puts tremendous pressure on the governments to return them to China. As described above, China's repression against the Uyghurs is worldwide. The One Belt, One Road initiative of China not only provides China with economic expansion to the world, but it also paves the way for China to control other countries' governing policies. For example, the situation of Kazakhstan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Kyrgyzstan, and many other countries. With that, keep in mind, China's genocide against Uyghurs requires absolute political control over East Turkestan and its people. If China succeeds in its overseas expansion, all the countries neighboring East Turkestan will be in China's sight next. In order to stop China's Zhongguomeng, which is Chinese Middle Kingdom dreams, we have to support each other. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. It was a very comprehensive description of what the Uyghur community is going through. And I must say, I've written a lot on this in a manner that I've tried to expose the strategy of three evils as Chinese call it, and the way they've carried out those physical atrocities which you aptly described, psychological transformation, social engineering, which you mentioned, and also changing the demography. And all those steps are basically looking at changing the demography. Also, China has a newfound passion for Xinjiang in a manner that Xinjiang is the hub of its Belt and Road Initiative when it comes to its communication line going eastward. also Xinjiang as well as Tibet are very rich in resources. So therefore, the exploitation of resources also goes along, and that also gives additional impetus to the Chinese atrocities to try and sinicize Xinjiang in a manner in which you just described. So therefore, there is no doubt that these are the issues which the world must flag, and these are the issues which should be raised in United Nations headquarters and every other forum. I would only like to answer two things. One is that you mentioned about India's trade. Certainly, whenever it is known that a particular item has used Xinjiang labor or Uyghur labor, generally that is being treated differently. And I think a number of restrictions we have put on the import of a number of items. You must have heard of Atmanirbhar Bharat and things like that. There are certain areas where we could not help. India needs raw material for the medicines, especially the vaccines during the corona period. Now, this is for global good. And the vaccines, the kind of vaccines which we are providing, which are effective and the cheapest in the world, is something which the whole world wants it from us. So for a common good, irrespective of from where the raw material comes, unfortunately, that was the only reason we had to go in for raw materials from countries including China. And it has shown effect. It has shown effect in India. It has shown effect in so many countries where we have given it for free, these vaccines. So therefore, I think that was one compulsion which we have found out. But in addition to that, if you come to think of it, I think a lot is being done in a manner that the Americans have also flagged this issue a number of times. This issue was never on the table. But as I mentioned, there are a number of other communities. I must also point out here, ma'am, that as you go and as you speak in various forums, you must sometimes ask the Islamic countries as well as to what is wrong. The Uyghurs are their Muslim brethren. Why is it that the Pakistani Prime Minister says that, oh no, I don't know what is happening there? And then why is it that he says that, oh, everything is fine there? Similarly, out of when it comes to condemnation of the genocide in Xinjiang, let me tell you, out of more than 3 dozen Islamic countries, there is hardly anyone who is standing. So I think these are issues which are serious issues, which we need to flag and which we collectively need to flag all over, whether it is your organizations or it is any right-thinking global citizen in the world. I think that is very much required and we must do that. So now I move on to the next area, which is again an area of concern, which saw a dramatic transition in the recent times. We had a democratic Hong Kong, and that democratic Hong Kong, in a very short span, turned into, again, another colony of China, which it was, but to an extent that the Chinese stronghold went there, became very strong there. And then there were complaints, there were, I would say, a lot of opposition, but then somehow the world community did not act as it should have to be able to perhaps save the situation in Hong Kong. And the situation remains what it is today. To speak more on that, we have Miss Catherine Lee. She is an independent artist as well as activist, born in Hong Kong. She is a performer and holds a MA Theatre degree from King's College, London. She also strives awareness abroad for Hong Kong arts and music. She is an advocate of rights of Hong Kong diaspora, oppression of CCP within and outside UK, as a self-exiled activist of both the communities. She has also had, I think, she has been competing for self-styled Hong Kong protester outfit in top model UK 2020. And you have been attending meetings with policymakers in UK and Europe, hosting rallies, speaking on the human rights issues, hosting exhibition, theme-based exhibitions and markets in various parts of the world, whether it is Prague, London, and other areas. So I think we couldn't have found a better person to speak on this topic than Miss Catherine. So over to you, ma'am. We would like to hear from your mouth as to what you feel and what do you think is the way forward.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and good evening, India, and good afternoon from the UK. My name is Catherine. So I am basically an activist that came out from the movement since 2019 in Hong Kong because I see there was a need. And today I would like to provide you a context very briefly first, an overview as to why, what happened to Hong Kong and why it has turned into such a situation today, and what kind of liberty is being suppressed, what freedoms we have lost, and then what the world should have been acting against the CCP. So for a very brief overview, Hong Kong was a British colony until the UK transferred the sovereignty over Hong Kong to China in 1997, and then Hong Kong became, as the common knowledge, became a special administrative region. And in preparation of handover, the UK and China agreed a joint declaration, a Sino-British joint declaration in 1984, which had brought the concept of one country, two systems, where Hong Kong should be able to enjoy a high degree of autonomy. For example, its own legal system, judiciary, and borders. And then the system is supposed to be preserved in the Basic Law, which is Hong Kong's constitutional document that came into force until after 1997. But then, and as listed in the declaration, which is a valid document, we are supposed to be able to enjoy our everything that is listed in the declaration for 50 years, which we should be able to observe some changes until at least 2047, which is 50 years after 1997. However, it is now the year 2022, and we can already see that lots and lots of terms and conditions have been violated in the joint declaration, and that Hong Kong no longer enjoys its freedom and autonomy. In 2014, there was this umbrella revolution, which in its heart was for people to fight for universal suffrage, because we believed under the Basic Law and the Joint Declaration, we should be able to enjoy our rights to vote for our own chief executive who rules Hong Kong. Whereas for now, under our well, not now, but in 2014, we could only vote for our district councillors and not even our legislators, but definitely not the chief executive, which we thought that it should be a right that we should fight for. And obviously that didn't work out. And then that moved on to 2016, which was the Fishbowl Revolution, a protest that aimed to protect the local culture, especially during the Lunar New Year festival, where there were hawkers at night markets and trying to sell local products. But then because during Lunar New Year, there were police officers trying to arrest every hawker basically, and didn't allow anyone to carry on selling stuff in the food market, and that led to rage and anger from especially the localism parties. And then that's why that's also when the major localist activist Edward Leung was arrested, who was the first person to propose "Liberate Hong Kong, Revolution of our Times," the slogan, which then actually evolved to become a major slogan for the movement in 2019, when there was this anti-extradition movement, which was one of the largest, which was actually the largest scale protest in Hong Kong that all the people, like 1 million to 2 million people, took it to the street and trying to stand up against the government, which was just 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago. And then the government's response to that was that the 2019 protest is an increasingly rampant activity by the Hong Kong independence elements and radical and separatist force, and that was escalating violence and terrorist activities. And because of this, that everything basically turned immediately worsened after 2019, because after all these protesting activities, and that the government has been trying to arrest lots of protesters, plus the COVID situation, used to enforce that new rule of anti-gathering. So that's why people can no longer take it to the street or protest. And when the national security law, I'm sorry, when the national security law was enforced, everybody starts to self-censor their freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and the press freedom was trampled upon. So sorry, I might be losing that bit, but
in case there is your voice is going on and off. In case there is an internet problem, what I suggest is you can switch off your camera and keep speaking. I think that will give a better voice.
Okay, thank you. If that happens again, I'll do that. Okay. And then so after the national security law was enforced, basically we can no longer shout even the slogan "Liberate Hong Kong, Revolution of our Times," because it could constitute subversion. And which is ridiculous, because Hong Kong used to be a place where we should be able to enjoy our very own freedoms and human rights. It is a very established city, which has a very high importance in the world, especially for a financial position. And then people, business traders, and foreign countries began to withdraw from their participation in Hong Kong in a lot of industries after the national security law was enforced. Particularly, we can see how our freedoms and liberties were being trampled upon by. Firstly, we can look at press freedom. In June 2021, the pro-democracy newspaper Apple Daily shut itself down after being twice raided by the police, and its owner and the senior editors arrested. Press freedom is a very important criterion to show the freedoms and liberties of a place, because without the press, without the reporters, journalists, we cannot actually we cannot actually show the news or what's actually happening on the grounds of Hong Kong. And with that, the biggest and the major pro-democracy newspaper being shut down. Afterwards, a few other independent news outlet, which is also pro-democracy, starts to shut down as well, including Stan News and C News, which I could say that on the ground now in Hong Kong, there are no pro-democracy newspaper media that is still standing because of their fear of being prosecuted and persecuted by the government. And so I can basically say that the press freedom is completely eradicated, and there is the only news media outlet that is still working is people try to move everything abroad, because after the national security law, there is this huge trend of leaving Hong Kong, fleeing, because they don't want to become political prisoners, and they don't want to lose their freedom of expressing anything. So that's why there are some reporters or journalists that moved away from Hong Kong, say, for example, to the UK, to Taiwan, to US, Canada, Australia. People start to form their own businesses to tell stories of Hong Kong to the world, especially setting up new media outlets to protect the press freedom. But for people who actually decided to do that, it's actually a very brave action for them, because by doing so, it could necessarily mean that they can no longer go back to Hong Kong because of their boldness to speak out and to report the truth against the local government. And then from this dire decision and from this phenomenon, we can actually see how such press freedom or such independent freedom to talk about anything that is against the government has already been removed, and we can no longer enjoy it. Not only is press freedom hugely affected, but we can also see our other freedoms of expression are being affected, especially in the arts and music industry, and also basically protest. As I mentioned, that because of the COVID rules and restrictions, the government has enforced that there a new law of anti-gathering, so not more than 4 people can gather at the same time in the streets of Hong Kong, which we all know that it's just an excuse to stop people from protesting. And not only do people no longer have ways to protest, but there are also all these artists and musicians that could no longer speak out their minds loudly, especially when during the movement there is this new national anthem, which was written by protesters in Hong Kong. And all these and that national anthem was a very popular choice, and that we were supposed to be singing it in protest and in the movement. However, because of the national security law, we can no longer sing the national anthem anymore, and it was completely banned in schools. And so we can see how our creativity or our freedom to create is no longer accepted in Hong Kong. And then talking about schools, there is also this new form of education being introduced in Hong Kong schools, where in February 2021, a new national security education curriculum was introduced in Hong Kong. And in August the same year, the largest teachers' union was shut down after being accused by pro-Chinese media of supporting the pro-democracy movement. And so basically, in schools, what is the national security curriculum about is basically, especially government-funded schools, they would have to they would have to march in the morning, sing the PRC's, the China's national anthem every day. And even more ridiculously, there are times where some students were taught to imitate again what happened in particular days during the 2019 movement, especially for example, on the 31st of August in 2019, there was this police raid in an MTR station, in a metro station in Hong Kong, where the police sprayed pepper spray and tear gas up close to not even protesters, but to civilians. And the schools were actually teaching the children to imitate the scene again, to show how brave the police officers were and that they should be served as role models. And that was completely ridiculous to teach children, because it not only conveys the message of violence, but it also tells children that to re-educate children on history, on Hong Kong movement's history, on which side is actually right and correct and doing righteous things, and that would completely brainwash the entire generation of children. Talking about brainwash, not only this sort of national security education was enforced, but also about the language, where because the Hong Kong puppet government basically nowadays allow lots of students from mainland China to come into Hong Kong to enter the schools. And so basically, judging from a lot of interviews from the civil societies or YouTubers, we can see how Mandarin was actually fused with Cantonese in a local school context environment. We can see how Hong Kong local students nowadays actually prefer to speak Mandarin even in their own families or with their friends. Personally, language is a very important element to conserve the culture and history of a place, particularly in Hong Kong, where Cantonese is our own unique language, where even when there are other cities or provinces in China that they would use Cantonese to speak, or even Malaysians, Singaporeans, they would use Cantonese. But in Hong Kong, Cantonese is we have our own variation to speak Cantonese. We have our own slangs, we have our own text, and we have our own things, words that only Hong Kongers would understand. And because of this fusion, where there are huge amounts of mainland students rushing into Hong Kong schools, and also how the schools attempted to teach Chinese subjects with Mandarin, basically using Mandarin to do dictation, asking them to read simplified Chinese, write simplified Chinese, which in Hong Kong we use traditional Chinese characters. So it's actually a complete wash of our culture, of years and decades of our culture, basically. And then by controlling how the children think and learn to speak and write, and what they see, what they read, what they use, this is a great way to manipulate how children of our next generation would think and act, and would completely become very patriotic towards China. And so this is another level of how our liberty and freedoms
Can we hear?
are being suppressed and actually changed. See, okay. There's another freedom or liberty. Okay, am I back? Okay, I'm back. Freedom and liberty being erased, being eradicated, especially in the electoral part, where you cannot run for an election if you're not pro-government. Basically from March 2021, China's legislative body passed significant changes to Hong Kong's electoral rules, which will tighten its control over the city. And the number of directly elected seats in Hong Kong's Legislative Council was cut almost by half. And prospective council members would have to be vetted by a candidate qualification review committee to ensure that only patriotic figures can run for positions of power. Basically, whoever wants to work for the government had to swear that they would be loyal and patriotic, which a lot of them decided not to do so. And as a result, a lot of them actually fled and left Hong Kong. And then a major incident after national security law was that over 50 pro-democratic activists was arrested on suspicion of breaking the national security law because they participated in a primary election in Hong Kong. So basically, from inside out, like from the children level, students' education level, to our electoral level, or anyone that is just a civilian in Hong Kong. Basically, I would say the freedom and liberty and every rights that we used to enjoy have been completely eradicated. And there is not much to be done in Hong Kong, which is desperate. And the only thing that people who have left Hong Kong nowadays, the diasporic community, is trying to do is to unite and connect with all the anti-CCP powers, especially Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Taiwanese, all these people that we are connecting together to actually increase our voice, to raise awareness against the Chinese Communist Party, and to ask the world to stop favoring China's and to allow aggression on their power, and also to especially ask or raise awareness on local governments and ask the foreigners to not to use China's product and to stop trading relationships with the CCP. And there are, of course, a lot more to do, and I think everyone can play a lot more part in stopping China's aggression. And that's basically what's happening in Hong Kong and why there are all these freedoms being suppressed. And yes, and that's all for me, basically. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. In fact, you covered a lot of ground in a manner that what is happening in Hong Kong, certainly there is an effort for sinicization. There is an effort to ensure that the integration, even the mental integration, is being ensured. And you mentioned about the national security law. The absurdity of this national security law is that it is supposed to be applicable anywhere in the world. So logically, if one is criticizing China or Communist Party, especially in particular, anywhere in the world, technically speaking, the moment you land up in Hong Kong airport, you can be arrested. So that is what the implication is, although absurd, but then that is what it is. So notwithstanding that, when we come back on the question answer session, if you could address as to how the economy of Hong Kong actually got impacted after the national security law was passed, and after, as you mentioned, a number of people have moved out, and the way the freedom of expression has been taken away. So we would like to hear at that point of time. Now, let me move on to the next speaker. When it came to the, shall I say, sinicization of Hong Kong or integration of Hong Kong, one country or one, shall I say, nation, I call it nation for various reasons, which I will explain later, which helped Hong Kong was Taiwan. And therefore, when I say that Taiwan also has a story to say, certainly as per Taiwanese, they are the real China, and they lost mainland in a civil war, which is still on, and as per the historians, it is not yet over. I have been to Hong Kong and I have been to Taiwan as well, and spent a lot of time in Taiwan, so I do understand the understand both. And as a military general, certainly I couldn't have been allowed by Chinese to go to Tibet and Xinjiang, but the other two places I have certainly visited. But notwithstanding that, we would like to hear the same from the expert from Taiwan. We have Dr. Russell, who is the Executive Director of GTI, also Senior Fellow in the Jamestown Foundation, Adjunct Fellow at the Pacific Forum. He is also a former Penn Campbell Fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy and a visiting scholar at University of Tokyo. He has also served as Research Fellow at Project 2049 Institute of National Security, and he has also been the editor of China Brief, which is very popular, and we all read it with the fair amount of, shall I say, educative mindset of the Jamestown Foundation. He has also been a special associate in the International Cooperation Department at the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy. So we couldn't have had a better speaker than you, Dr. Russell, to educate us as to what you feel is happening in Taiwan. The fact that every day you hear the news of Chinese trying to breach the airspace of Taiwan, and every second day they keep repeating the idea of perhaps rejuvenation or rejoining the Taiwan to the mainland by force if necessary. How practical it is, we would like to hear from you, because I have also written a lot on this, and certainly we would like to hear straight from you. So over to you now on the Taiwan issue.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Major General, and the Indic Researchers Forum for the invitation to participate in this panel discussion. Allow me to note up front that I'm going to approach the topic that was assigned on the threat of Taiwan invasion much more from an analytical standpoint and less from an activist standpoint. And I'll approach this issue basically by discussing three dichotomies of the ongoing debate about the threat of a Taiwan invasion. And these three dichotomies are basically imminence versus urgency as the first. And the second is capabilities versus intention. And the third dichotomy is invasion versus gray zone warfare. And I think these three dichotomies are defining the parameters about the ongoing debate about the threat of Taiwan invasion, which is the topic at hand. So on the first dichotomy on imminence versus urgency, I think this is important because there's been a great deal of discussion of late with regards to the imminence of a Taiwan invasion. This obviously focuses on the temporal aspect of the prospect of an invasion by China. And this was highlighted by the former commander of Indo-PACOM, Admiral Phil Davidson, last year in March, where he highlighted that he believes that the threat of a Taiwan invasion could manifest within 6 years, which means from that point before 2027. This has kicked off a very robust debate in the United States and internationally about the threat that Taiwan faces and the proper responses by the United States and its allies as well as partners. And while I do think that China has a deadline in terms of a timeline, if you may, in terms of the unification of Taiwan, it's not, I think, what many people think in terms of a more imminent deadline. I believe that it is defined largely by what the general has actually alluded to earlier, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And by that, a timeline defined by General Secretary Xi Jinping and its predecessor to be done by the midpoint of the century by 2049. And of course, I think it's very clear for everyone that Taiwan's unification with the People's Republic of China would be central to that goal of the Chinese Communist Party. But nevertheless, I don't think that even though an invasion may not be imminent, it is no less urgent. And the reason I say that is because I think less of a more imminent timeline for this invasion, it is very conditional. And those conditions can change. Those conditions can be defined by two primary factors, and those are political and military. And while the military conditions are worsening, for sure, the political conditions have not gotten better either. And that's why I think that given the unpredictability of the situation and the sort of fluid nature of these conditions, it is the situation is unpredictable, and therefore it's still very urgent, nevertheless, to make sure that we make the necessary preparations to ensure that China does not make the decision to invade Taiwan. We simply cannot wait for a crisis to start to begin serious preparations, planning, training, coordination. It would be too late by that point, and it would lead to a fait accompli. And we cannot necessarily set aside or wait until the legal and political constraints are completely resolved to really begin such preparation. And therefore, while I believe that an invasion is not imminent per se, it is no less urgent to address this issue in terms of the threat of a Taiwan invasion. This leads me to the second point, the second dichotomy, which essentially is on the capabilities versus intention. Any student of military strategy would, of course, point out that capabilities does not equal intention. But nevertheless, I do think it's important to highlight that those capabilities inform intention. And that's why it's still a useful analytical tool to assess the extent to which China's calculus in determining whether to invade Taiwan. On the capability side, I do think it's important to highlight some facts, which is areas wherein we can set some basic foundational understanding about where China's capabilities are. And therein, I think it's important to highlight Taiwan's defense minister's recent comments that Taiwan assesses that China will have the capabilities to execute a full-scale invasion of Taiwan by 2025. Furthermore, as is, I think, well known amongst the moderator as well as perhaps others on this in this discussion, that the China's military budget has been growing by leaps and bounds for at least the last 20 years. And this is, of course, really leading to a growing military imbalance in the Taiwan Strait. And I think many defense analysts worry would lead Beijing to conclude that it would be advantageous to engage in military aggression against Taiwan sooner rather than later. I mean, this was highlighted as much by the admiral, and that I had referenced earlier, and in it, in his testimony that highlighted what is now popularly termed the Davidson window. He stated that, I worry that they're accelerating their ambitions to supplant the United States in our leadership role in the rules-based international order by 2050. We are accumulating risks that may embolden China to unilaterally change the status quo before our forces may be able to deliver an effective response. And that is the point that I wanted to highlight with regards to the capability side, that it could be that the capabilities that China develops could be so overwhelming that they would be incentivized to use military force to resolve the issue once and for all. That is also because we cannot rule out its intention to use force to resolve the cross-strait dispute by military force. It has continued to refuse to renounce the use of force against Taiwan to resolve the dispute, despite the understandings reached between the United States and the People's Republic of China in the negotiations of the various communiques. And of course, its actions in recent years demonstrate a clear unwillingness on its part to abide by such commitments. And that it has only shown as its military capabilities grow, a willingness to utilize its military assets to provoke, intimidate, and coerce Taiwan and its people. And therefore, I think it is incumbent and prudent for strategists, planners, obviously, certainly government, to plan accordingly and address this threat. But just as I said earlier, just because China has the capabilities to do so does not mean that they will do so. And even though its capabilities are growing, I do believe that that China still prefers to win without fighting and pursue its unification goals without the use of military force, provided, of course, political and military conditions are those political military conditions remain imbalanced. So this I will then proceed to the third dichotomy here, which is relevant to the first two, and that is the invasion versus gray zone warfare dichotomy that seems to pervade much of ongoing debate, particularly in the United States, with regards to what type of preparations are necessary in order to ensure the security of Taiwan. And in some ways, I do think this is somewhat of a false binary. You have to choose between whether or not to prepare for an invasion or to prepare for gray zone warfare. The fact of the matter is I think that we have to prepare for both. And just as China is developing its capabilities and means to engage in both types of threats to Taiwan. And I think this stems in part because the threat facing Taiwan is also very political in nature and not just military. And even though the threat of an invasion is real, and China is preparing for war, but I don't think we need to remind anyone here that the Chinese Communist Party has been preparing for war since 1949. What is often forget is that there are political effects of military operations, and I think it's perhaps useful here as a reference for everyone here that Karl von Clausewitz, which is a very famous Prussian military general and theorist, stated that war is basically a continuation of politics by other means, and I think in this respect, the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army are students, are good students of this military strategy. And so for a very long period of time, given I think the lack of awareness and effective responses to Beijing's gray zone warfare, which by just I think for reference of the audience, which basically include activities that fall below the threshold of triggering military responses, primarily by the United States. And it has been effective in being able to change the facts on the ground and being able to create conditions that favor its political objectives in these theaters. I think the case of the South China Sea is a very good case in point in terms of its island building campaigns here. and forcing basically the other claimants to accept its administrative control, and by extension, acquiescence, if you will, of its legal control over such territory, despite, of course, distinctions that are clearly at hand in terms of its control over those territories. It is through this approach of gray zone warfare, or I think political warfare would also be a very useful applicable term to cover this types of activities that China is really engaging in very extensive gray zone warfare against Taiwan, and I think this type of comprehensive pressure campaign can be basically be characterized by 10 various elements, and that's, diplomatic coercion, military coercion, economic coercion, and within the sort of diplomatic coercion camp, it involves international pressure campaigns in terms of international organizations that Taiwan tries to participate in. It applies to the economic side. It falls under pressures of businesses and corporations that we are increasingly see internationally with regards to issues that extend beyond Taiwan. In fact, this pressure campaign extends to not only just diplomatic allies of Taiwan, which currently it retains only 14 diplomatic allies that recognize the Republic of China, Taiwan. It also includes, but it's not all sticks, it's some carrots as well. And as part of this is also I consider this as part of the pressure campaign because it's intended to shape the choices that the government in Taiwan is able to make. But these are also economic incentives that they offer through preferential measures that it would offer to businesses and people from Taiwan to essentially, basically move and live and provided with essentially a preferential status, if on par, if not in some circumstances, advance of Chinese citizens. I think some of the comments made earlier, particularly in the case of, in the case of all Tibet, Xinjiang, and Hong Kong, are political warfare activities that are really subversive in nature, and this is also happening within Taiwan. And within the political warfare capabilities that they were, means that they utilize, United Front is a very important element of that. And I think, we heard from Catherine earlier about, the education campaign, and I think that's a very telling case of that. And I would be, interested to hear much of what she has to say with regards to how the education campaigns right now are, really reorienting Hong Kong towards the PRC. We can go into that in greater details later. And then the last two elements are cyber and espionage, and I think those are probably more easily understood, and perhaps does not require further explanation on my part. So I'll conclude by basically making 4 points on why I think this should matter to India. The first is that I believe a successful invasion of Taiwan will firmly establish China's hegemony in the Indo-Pacific. India will therefore be directly impacted politically, militarily, economically, and diplomatically as well with regards to that hegemony. A China that is increasingly confident will also more likely engage in greater assertiveness as well as aggressive actions on its longstanding territorial disputes. India, of course, comes to mind with regards to its border disputes with China. And a conflict over Taiwan is very unlikely to be contained within the Taiwan Strait. Just primarily, this is where I think the Japanese are the most concerned about with regards to a contingency in the Taiwan Strait. And I think we've seen the former Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, has actually made some very significant statements recently, with basically imploring the United States to forego its approach of strategic ambiguity, which essentially, neither commits the United States to explicitly come to Taiwan's defense, nor does it indicate that it wouldn't necessarily do that. And as a result of this approach to response to a military contingency over Taiwan, it effectively serves as a dual deterrent, both to deter the PRC from invading Taiwan, with the assumption that it would have to contend with U.S. intervention, but furthermore to deter Taipei from engaging in political actions that will essentially move to de jure independence. And so I do think it's telling in the sense that the former Japanese Prime Minister now is calling on the United States to move away from strategic ambiguity to strategic clarity. And I think my sense of why the former Prime Minister of Japan has made such very forward and bold statements has as much to do with its own domestic political considerations within Tokyo. There are obvious constraints in terms of Tokyo's ability to respond, in various scenarios in the Taiwan contingency. And he has made the political statement to the effect that a Taiwan contingency is a Japanese contingency, but that is a political statement and much less of a legal interpretation of what it is legally able to do in the event. And so, a move and shift from in the United States from ambiguity to clarity would necessarily also help move debates within Japan with regards to how it could potentially respond to a Taiwan contingency. Thirdly, I think New Delhi has a strategic interest in keeping China focused on its maritime periphery. This means that it has less resources to its continental borders, and the Sino-Indian border skirmishes in 2020 comes to mind with regards to this issue of being able to keep China. This is not to say that China is not doing both right now. It's obviously investing in its continental borders, but I think its primary focus right now is on its maritime periphery. And finally, I think we're moving towards an international system that will be increasingly defined by layered blocks or coalitions. That's my personal view on this. One of these blocks will be between democracies and versus autocracies. And there's going to be one also between pro-hegemonic and versus anti-hegemonic coalitions. And China's, I think, sees this. It has seen, it has defined much of what it sees as the threats that it faces, in addition to the three evils, of course, that the general had alluded to earlier, but in a very telling document with regards to its fears about Western values and democracy, in an internal document, document number 9, it really highlights this fear that it has. And I think within this context, China's support of India's neighbors, I think would grow increasingly over time as well. And so I think it's important that India pays very close attention to what is happening. So with that, let me conclude and turn it over to the moderator, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. In fact, you gave a very comprehensive analysis, very insightful analysis of the China's threat. And I couldn't agree with you more, but I certainly would like to add few issues since I have also been tracking Taiwan for quite some time. Firstly, there's no doubt that China may have the capability by 2027, 25, 27 is anybody's guess, because Americans' assessment have been quite wonky in terms of Afghanistan, and also when they were talking about 72 hours offensive of Russians and things like that. So without going into that, there is no doubt that they do not have that kind of amphibious facility or capabilities, and that is why this calculation of 2025 or 2027 was there. As far as the firepower is concerned, using that much of firepower on Taiwan, that is a far-fetched requirement for the simple reason, because there is a saying in Hindi, which I will translate in English, and that will convey the point, that you do not kill a hen which gives you golden egg every day, because the amount of investment which Taiwan does in China, the amount of money which China makes out of Taiwan is something which they will not like to destroy. And the destruction of Taiwan does not suit the economic, perhaps the economic interest of China. So that's one issue. Secondly, if the democratic wind starts flowing from Taiwan to mainland China, they have a very serious problem at hand, especially the Communist Party. And coupled with that, if it also gets a big, shall I say, setback in the economic field, then it becomes a very serious issue for them. So it's not an easy option to invade Taiwan. And despite Xi Jinping making all the noises from 2013 onwards, which I have been seeing, it is 2022 now. So almost about 9 years have passed, and he has been continuing to make this noise. In my opinion, when they are sending and breaching the airspace of Taiwan, the requirement is more to do with political warfare, as you mentioned. Because I was there in Taiwan when Chen Shui-bian was the president. So when DPP is in power, Chinese are a little more concerned that their 3-no principle, or they may violate some of them, of either declaring a total independence or getting nuclear, or some such funny thing may happen. So they want to perhaps mitigate that and keep Taiwan under pressure that that thing doesn't happen, and hope like hell that DPP loses the next election and they get a pro-Chinese government, and then they don't have to do all this, and they can thereafter keep talking about peaceful reunification and things like that, and carry on with the status quo that one country, two system, whatever they call it, although Taiwan may not allude to or may not agree with them. So that's one issue. The second issue is Taiwan also perhaps needs to diversify. Your investments are far too much in China, that you may say that yes, you are a sovereign entity, but then the fact is the economic engagement is far too much. So if you have all your eggs in one basket, you have a serious issue there. So therefore, I think a diversification is, you also spoke of the world community and the democracies getting together, and therefore there is a realization of over dependence on Chinese supply chain and Chinese as a global factory. So therefore, I think an alternate supply chain is required, and therefore you need to have your alternate markets as well. You can't have chip manufacturing. Chip is the most sensitive issue with China, with China, and you have the soft power as far as chip manufacturing is concerned. So if this soft power has to be exercised, certainly there is a need for India and Taiwan to collaborate and have the chip manufacturing at a much greater scale in India, or by the principle of Make in India, to an extent that you perhaps diversify and reduce your dependence on China. That's one issue. The second issue is the dependence on United States. Yes, they have got all kinds of treaties with you, which is something like Taiwan Relation Act and Taiwan Travel Act and National and NADA, that is the recent one. But notwithstanding that, what has happened is United States physical intervention into conflict has suffered, and the confidence has suffered a great setback. And you mentioned about Japan. Certainly, I think Japan is also thinking almost on the similar lines, because if they could not save Armenia, if they could not save Greece, which is a NATO member, there is a question mark as to how much this strategy of ambiguity will finally transform into some kind of the comprehensive strategy to take on China. So therefore, the initial onslaught, as you rightly mentioned, the conflict with Taiwan will not remain confined to Taiwan, but the initial onslaught will have to be borne by Taiwan. I have seen your armed forces, and they are reasonably well modernized armed forces. And going by the experience of Ukraine, I must tell you that irrespective of the asymmetry of numbers, you will find that a determined country under a determined leader with a determined military and determined population can create a tremendous amount of problem for an aggressor. And therefore, there are certain lessons which I am sure China also must be very keenly observing, that the amount of global condemnation which can play up under such circumstances can at least postpone the Chinese dream, so-called the Chinese dream of becoming a global or a superpower by 2049. And if Xi Jinping has his way, he would like to perhaps prepone that dream even in 2030, or at least during his third term or something like that. But I don't think that is happening so easily. So apparently there is a lot to ponder. And I wrote a piece in South China Morning Post, and there was a PLA general also who wrote us a piece on that. And both the pieces were almost in consonance with each other to say that in cost benefit analysis, it doesn't make any sense, any strategic sense for China to invade Taiwan. What they are getting out of Taiwan as of today is the best case scenario. The only thing is what they are trying to do is, as I mentioned, they do not want their red line to be crossed in some manner or the other by the DPP government. So leaving at that, what I would now request, I will throw the house open. There are few questions which are there. I think one is on Tibet. There is something on, there is a comment, I would not say question, on Hong Kong. And there is also a question on Taiwan. So we will have the answers from the respective panelists, first from Tibet, and then we will talk about, I think in the same order in which we spoke. You can answer whatever you have and any additional point which you have in the same sequence. So we go first to our panelist from Tibet and follow the same sequence. And maybe you can take about 4 to 5 minutes each, because we have time till another 25 minutes. So about 3 to 4 minutes each, and then we could wind up. So
Okay.
over to the first speaker.
Thank you, Major General Asthana. It was an amazing presentation from everyone. So thank you for enlightening me. With regards to this comments on Tibet's invasion or Tibet's annexation being, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
in regards to this comment on Tibet's annexation being blunder, I know Tibetans did reach out to the UN in 1950 when China or the Mao Zedong started invading Tibet. Unfortunately, it led nowhere, and although several resolutions were passed in 1959 and then a few years later, but there was only some sort of condemnation, but there was no concrete action as such. So today we know that the UN is not fit for purpose, and this is being raised all around the world. This five, when they exercise their veto power, I think nothing can be really done. So no wonder NATO is sort of, an alternative body like NATO was formed to secure interests for those members. And then some say this Quad alliance is possibly NATO in Asia or Indo-Pacific. So whatever the case may be, I think the Tibet's invasion by China is a big lesson to be learned, I think. That's what I want to say. And obviously, there was no interest or political will from countries around the world. Perhaps it was a war fatigue after the Second World War and so on. In regards to the main question, the thinking of young generation or next generation in Tibet in regards to CCP's trade-off on religious freedom with, I think when he said amenities, I'm thinking of funding pouring into Tibet. It is true that China pumps bits of uranium into Tibet Autonomous Region and other areas of Tibet. And it might be benefiting some minority Tibetans. And when the road is built, for example, it's bound to be benefited by whoever commutes or travels on those roads and train stations and so trains and so on. What we know is that it is a strategic and political decision on the part of the Chinese government to build such infrastructure because of mining, for example, sort of extracting resources and then transporting back to China. And then the military installation near the Tibet-India border is also there to put pressure on China. So I think this is one side. Now, in regards to Tibetans who are, as I said earlier, more sort of engaged in internal development rather than physical or infrastructure development. Yes, we are not able to fully or freely exercise our own beliefs. Nonetheless, Tibetans know how powerful CCP or the China is, and it has total grip and control over the Tibetans, literally all lives really across Tibetan regions. And I think Tibetans know that. And speaking of openly, it's they will face immediate consequences. And we know that since 2009, nearly 160 Tibetans have self-immolated, engaging in a protest because there is no other form of protest. I think that shows that Tibetans are not happy in their own homelands, as I was referring to the restrictions of movement of Tibetans in their own homelands. Whereas if you're Han Chinese, you can travel freely across any part of Tibet. I think that says a lot. I want to give one example. A few years ago, I met a young Tibetan who was studying in England, and then he was returning back to Tibet, and he was saying that, I want to go back and help with the administration of our way. I'm not going to say which part, but sort of help with administration of his region. So this is one example. Young Tibetans are willing to do for their homelands and their communities The key thing is that they're waiting for opportunities. And when the global situation, it's conducive for the Tibetans, I think when the time comes to rise up, I think Tibetans will rise again, which we did back in the 1950s. And yes, temporarily, we have to bow down to what the communist dictators demand, but they have not managed to win the hearts and minds of all the Tibetans. Maybe few who just go after Chinese yuan. I hope that answered the question from the gentleman.
Okay, thank you. Now, do we have Ms. Zubayra? You could address whatever has been mentioned as a clarification from your side, and anything which you would like to add.
Thank you for the opportunity. I did not see any questions on the chat box, but I just wish to actually clarify or explain that your concern about why the Muslim countries are not supporting Uyghurs or just stay silent despite the genocide is happening to their Muslim brothers sisters. I think it's really great concern and something that importantly I should brought up here. Yes, definitely the Uyghurs are almost 98% they are Muslims, but right now many majority Muslim countries are staying silent. It's because of China's huge and heavy financial and diplomatic pressure towards the neighboring countries as well as Muslim countries. And on top of that, even Chinese government is supporting those countries' policies as well, governing policies. That means, the most of those countries are authoritarian. The China don't care because they criticize the human rights violations or any other rights violations, people's rights or whatever, something. That kind of relationship is, for those dictatorial or authoritarian regimes, what China did is quite appealing. Despite all these, the good relationship between the Muslim country authorities as well as Chinese government, but we still see that support from the people, the people who belong to those countries, despite that pressure, despite the risk that they would face if they do anything that government don't allow them to do. Like, for example, recently we have witnessed that many Muslim, the majority groups in Malaysia, Indonesia, even some groups in Turkey, definitely the Turkish government does quite, huge trade relationship with China, and also some other countries as well. But the population, they are supportive. And also another big issue is China's propaganda and censoring and stopping the message to deliver to those countries. It's the huge, giant propaganda of Chinese government about the Uyghurs and what's happening in East Turkestan. It's another issue because those countries, they got no idea. Like, for example, when China showcased the world about the freedom of religion, freedom of expression or speech, and especially in particular showing about the Muslims practicing religion, they mostly showcased the Hui Muslims, which is Hui. That means they are basically Chinese Muslims. They culturally, linguistically, they are Chinese people, but religiously they are Muslim. That's what they did for many years to deceive the world, saying that, look, see, this is Muslims of China, and we're giving full freedom to practice religion. And they have invited some Muslim groups from Muslim countries to visit those Hui area, which is Gansu, which is mainland China. And it's just an absolute kind of staged views or staged observation that's showing that, look, this is what we've been doing. But you don't see or you don't hear that any that kind of independent Muslim groups or Muslim countries visited East Turkestan, talked with Muslim Uyghurs, which is majority Muslim population in China, or visited the area of Muslims. As I told you before, over 16,000 mosques has been destroyed. I have not seen any Muslim countries or Muslim groups visit the country and seen or observe or just to check that whether this has happened. But it's the facts are there. Most of the facts are came out from Chinese official documents. They have documented. They have showed the pictures of how they are destroying all the mosques or churches even from mainland China. So many churches are destroyed as well. And this is the situation. Power, propaganda, pressure. With that, they buy off the silence of those countries. So that's I wish to bring up here. Thank you.
I totally agree with you. In fact, it is an irony and hypocrisy of the highest order for a simple reason, because you find that one incident which may not have happened in India, we find whole lot of Muslim countries jumping up the gum tree to say that, okay, this is what has happened, this is etc. etc. But in Xinjiang, so much has happened, which you rightly explained and very aptly explained. A virtual silence by almost all of them speaks that perhaps the leadership in most of the countries has been bought over, and at the end of the day, money matters. Perhaps that is an unfortunate thing, but notwithstanding that, I'm sure you and your organization will continue to work for the humanity and the human right of issues, because human right of every human being, irrespective of which caste, creed, religion, and which part of the world a person belongs to, is important. And as global citizens, I think we all must stand for human right of everybody in every part of the world. Okay, now Catherine, I think it's your turn. You may like to amplify on some of the issues which I just highlighted, and if there is something on the chat box for you.
Yes, I'm so sorry for dropping out of the call for a bit because my network was down, and I hope it wouldn't be. I just hope it wouldn't be down again. Okay, so before when I ended my previous speech, you were asking me about the economy and about businesses that could withdraw, that was withdrawn from Hong Kong, and potentially expand on that. I wanted to maybe expand a little bit on that because I think it's very important for people to understand what it means to do business with Hong Kong nowadays, because under the national security law, it's working with Hong Kong nowadays, it essentially would mean doing business with China, essentially. So there are a lot of security risk that could be posed to these businesses, which in turn make them decide to leave Hong Kong and move their headquarters away from Hong Kong, essentially. And especially when there are all these global disputes and bans regarding 5G and Huawei, and so there are all these trade disputes that have been going on since 2020, when the national security law was enforced in July. And then people were worried about their data not being secured. How I would say it's because there's this PRC data security law, and companies would have to face heavy penalties if they transfer their sensitive data outside PRC borders, if they still decide to work in Hong Kong for their businesses. And so that's why in China, we see, in Hong Kong or in China, we actually see a lot of memes or posts that mock about how Xi Jinping would read everything that you have on your phone, you have on your company database. And so this is true because they have high surveillance, and whenever you have to go through the data in PRC, like exchange data with PRC businesses, or basically having your companies or offices in China, the PRC Xi Jinping, they could just read it, and that actually go the same in Hong Kong after the national security law, because it symbolizes Hong Kong is no longer a different city, or no longer has this one country two system existing in Hong Kong. That's why it's the companies are actually withdrawing, and that's why Hong Kong being used to be a port where there are all these foreign investment would take place and could act as a middle point between the negotiation between China and the foreign businesses, no longer exist, because well, the tax systems are still different, but there are all these dangers and risks that lie underneath that would pose potential dangers and legal challenges for all these companies, especially foreign companies that used to have their headquarters in Hong Kong. So that's why those are a lot of points. Those are the main points where the foreign businesses would consider when they want to work out their positions in Hong Kong. And also judging from, I don't know, so also besides talking about the economy, also asked me about the activists arrested, and then about on the activists that were arrested under national security law. There are more than 50 of them, basically, and they were targeted for, they were accused of trying to overthrow the government. And so not only are these more than 50 activists being arrested in Hong Kong, but there are also many activists on exile, such as some very famous legislators, including Ted Ho, who is now in Australia, and also Nathan Law, who is currently in the UK. And these are pro-democracy activists, and they were previously legislators of Hong Kong. But because they think that they wanted to keep carrying on to do advocacy and raise awareness about Hong Kong and the policing issues, that's why they decided to flee. And so it's a picture where it's either in jail when you stay, or you would have to flee to live in another strange new country and to keep voicing about Hong Kong, but about a place that you can no longer live in. So that's why it's being a really difficult situation, no matter in economy or in politics, for all of us here. And you can see now that I'm not in Hong Kong, I'm in the UK. And it's basically the same for all of us on civilians level or legislators level or businesses. So it's a really dire situation. And I think that's pretty much what I wanted to add on. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. In fact, you've very aptly answered the question. There's no doubt that if Jack Ma can be moderated, I'm sure everybody can be moderated in China. So yes, there is a serious issue there. So now, Dr. Russell, I think there are few remarks. I would put it on the chat box, and anything which you would like to comment. Another 3-4 minutes.
Well, thank you, General. And then I'm cognizant of the limited time that we have, and so I'll make my concluding comments brief. And just to pick up on a couple of your very astute comments that you made in response to my presentation. The first of which I would just offer as part of the broader considerations about the threat of a Taiwan invasion, and this observation falls more in favor of growing concerns about the threat that faces Taiwan and also the region as a whole, and that is primarily with regards to the pace at which China has been accelerating the fielding of its military hardware and capabilities, and I think that has had many in the analytical community surprised and concerned with regards to the pace at which they are developing and fielding such capabilities. And there's a saying around town now that you can still be moving fast, but if your opponent, your adversary, is moving faster than you, you can still get run over, right? And I think that is that is sort of in a situation sort of characterizes the situation that we find ourselves in. And while that itself is, I think, an important area of consideration, I do think the overall debate nonetheless oftentimes neglects the fact that this is, that China is not the only player, right? And obviously, this a lot of times the balance of threats that and what we can do about it will depends a large part about really what Taiwan does for itself, but also in terms of what the United States and its allies and partners would do in response. And so this is oftentimes when we are focused on the threats, we focus on the capabilities and of course the intention of the People's Republic of China. But nonetheless, of course, there's a lot that Taiwan, the United States, its allies and partners, India, to include India, really can do to prevent this competition from spiraling into a military conflict. And I'm confident that we are all capable of doing that with the right sense of urgency about the situation that we are in. To the point about diversification, I'm completely in agreement with the need that Taiwan needs to diversify. And I think that there has been, a recognition at the senior-most levels within Taipei that there is that the overdependence upon the Chinese market obviously presents a very high risk. Obviously, but it does, of course, take time and resources to diversify. I would just add that I think under the current administration in Taiwan, there's been a revamped effort under what's called the Taiwan's new southbound policy, which seeks to engage partners in Southeast Asia as well as in South Asia and in India being a primary partner within that policy framework to diversify. And I think that there should be, there are, and I think that there ought to be more strategic dialogues between, Taiwan and India to address, again, this broader sort of supply chain, high-tech supply chain issues that, where I do sense that there are, many complementary interests between India and Taiwan with regards to trying to, again, address this broader issue of to just pick up on a couple of the questions that's on the chat board. I think on the areas of cyberspace, it's really one of the areas where I think no one's really immune from the threats of PLAs or generally MSS or MSS-PLA, cyber espionage, and cyber attacks, and its capabilities are growing there. And I think Taiwan has a good deal of experience in dealing with threats from China in cyberspace. And in some respects, China utilizes Taiwan as a sort of as a springboard, if you will, in terms of its attacks to other nations and the effects that and being able to draw from and learn from Taiwan's experiences, its reservoir of various malwares and of course techniques that China uses. It's something that I think is increasingly more recognized. That there's obviously a risk in terms of the level of penetration in Taiwan from China's cyber activities, and there are definitely a lot of measures that Taiwan should be undertaking to shore up its system, especially if if it wants to work closer with the United States and allies and partners to make sure that its information systems are being able to be secure. And that's an area where I think there still needs to be work and needs to be, and I think there are more partners that can be involved in this, that the better. And I think India is well placed to that. On the question of India's One China policy, I think it's perhaps just useful in context to sort of to provide a reference point that this is a discussion that's going on in the United States as well. The former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo had recently made the statement that calling on the U.S. government to reestablish diplomatic relations with Taiwan. And so there is this, there is obviously a discussion within the U.S. With regards to its One China policy and how that and what would need to be done to ensure that there could be a more effective defense of Taiwan. And I think in a sense it's a recognition that there are political and legal impediments to the extent to which the United States can currently engage counterparts in Taiwan in a manner that would provide for a more effective defense of Taiwan. So if you assume that the threats facing Taiwan right now are so severe and imminent, as some people do believe, and of course this is something that is certainly debatable, but nevertheless, regardless of the imminence of debate, the urgency of the matter necessitates a consideration of whether or not there are the means to do it. Right, the means to do it, and that and I think there's certainly a healthy debate to be had about whether a more normal a relationship to include political, military relations would be necessary in order to ensure that in the event that a conflict occurs, that the United States could effectively respond to it. I think this is made perhaps even more urgent in the face of the war in Ukraine, and while I think with regards to how Ukraine factors into Beijing's consideration, that's certainly a very interesting area to have a discussion about. But that's perhaps better saved for a separate panel. But finally, just to add that I think that there are important political, military considerations to any type of legal changes that may be necessitated by a change, and I think India would be well served by having a healthy debate about whether or not that is necessary on its part to be able to serve its own national interests. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll in fact wind up in 2 minutes. Firstly, thank you very much for your answer, as well as your whatever additional points which you gave and some of the clarifications which you gave. Let me tell you, there are 1 or 2 points. Yes, India and Taiwan both are working a lot to collaborate in so many issues, and some of the issues which were mentioned in the chat box, I think they are certainly on the table. In addition to the trade issues, the fact somebody talked of the One China, India's One China policy. There is nothing like India's One China policy. The One China policy is only of China. Others use various phrases that we agree with your One China policy or we respect your One China policy. As far as India is concerned, our foreign minister Sushma Swaraj had very clearly said, if you respect One India policy, then we can respect your One China policy. Otherwise, the fact that there is a standoff on, so obviously they are not respecting One India policy, and the ceremony of oath-taking ceremony of President Tsai was attended by 2 of our ministers. That should give adequate indication as to which way the India is talking about, because India has strategic autonomy and we insist on our strategic autonomy. So that's one part of it. And as far as all other issues are concerned, you've answered all. It remains for me to thank all the panelists and for the wonderful exposition which they gave, a wonderful analysis which we got. And you are the people who know the pulse of the areas which you represent. And therefore, it couldn't have been better for us to listen and understand and grasp as to what you all have said. And we certainly carry a fair amount of, shall I say, insight which you all have given to us for times to come. And I think, again, the last messages which I would like to give is, yes, the human right and the humanity takes precedence irrespective of which corner of the world you are. And certainly the human beings must stand together wherever there is a human right violation. So that's with that, it's over to the organizers. And I think we are almost, we have little overshot the time, but it was worth it. The discussion was worth it. So over to the organizers, over to Sneha.
Thank you, sir. I would like to thank all the speakers, session chairs, and participants for joining the Decoding the Idea of Communist China conference. We would also like to thank the Chennai Center for China Studies for joining us for this initiative. I would like to request all the participants who have attended 6 of the 9 sessions to kindly send an email with their names for the e-certificate. The session recordings will be uploaded on our YouTube channel on 7th May. Till then, follow us on our social media platforms to stay tuned for our upcoming projects. Till then, namaste and goodbye from India and Indic Researchers Forum.
Thank you. Jai Hind.
Jai Hind, sir.